you need to read this book, Desizing the Church. And I told him what it was about, and he says, I think you're right that I need to read it, because as soon as you said the title, I felt angry.
Oh. Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and welcome to the Church Lobby, conversations on faith and ministry, and to the last of a 10-episode series within a series about my new book, Desizing the Church. In this episode, I'm getting some more first reactions. This time I'm grabbing snippets of conversations that I've had with several guests about various parts of the book. First up is Dyck. As my editor at Moody, Drew was actually the very first person to read the entire book. Not only that, but he was highly responsible for helping it happen. I had a hard time with the subject matter of this book, and I kept wanting to write about something else because I just couldn't get a handle on it. But Drew, like a good editor does, kept nudging me that this was a subject worthy of the work and that I was the right person to write it. So, in this excerpt from our conversation, Drew comments on the idea of Christian celebrity. As someone who's in the Christian publishing world, he knows maybe more than he wants to know about that. And we talk about chasing platforms as well. So I asked him why this subject was so compelling to him, and here's some of his response.
Yeah, well, I just think it's such a challenge, especially in this time we're in right now, because it used to be, you could have a measure of celebrity within a local congregation if you're the pastor or the leader. These days, though, what I see is a lot of people, and I do this to a degree myself, we all do, but you try to have a broader influence beyond your local church, right? Through social media and avenues like that. So I think that the scale is larger, the temptation is greater to try to blow up. And of course, you look, on Instagram and these places, and you see people blowing up overnight, it seems, and becoming a big deal. And you go, man, did I miss the memo? I need to do that too. I need to get out there and make a name for myself. And of course, that can be very dangerous to your soul. When it's a pastor doing that, it can be dangerous for the local church, his parishioners. And so, yeah, I just think it's such a pressing conversation that we need to have. And first of all, we need to realize that there's a tension there in between platform and spiritual leadership. Some people seem blissfully unaware of that. They're just, trying to become famous or a big deal, not realizing the inherent dangers in that. So you have to realize there's a tension there, and then you have to wrestle with it at each step of the way. And I love the balance that you bring in that chapter, because you don't say, a large church isn't bad. Having a platform isn't bad in and of itself, but aiming for that is very dangerous, right? If that's your goal, that does something to your soul that is bad for you and bad for others. And so that's part of the conversation inevitably, but man, it can get lopsided if you're not careful. If you start kind of going, well, this person's theology is really questionable, but they have 100,000 followers on Instagram and they speak at all these conferences, or their character is a little shaky, but we're going to disregard that because they have this large platform. And it's very easy to kind of subtly, imperceptibly almost make those trade-offs. And so we have to be really careful. One question that I ask myself, because that's my day job, I work as an editor for Moody Publishers, is would I trust this person? Because I'm working on Christian books, right? Would I trust this person as my pastor? And if the answer is no, maybe we shouldn't be publishing their books, because sometimes the parachurch has been a part of this problem of celebrity in the church, because we prop people up that maybe shouldn't have been platformed in the first place, often because they do have a large platform themselves. So we got to be careful not to do that, making sure that someone's platform isn't outpacing their character. And it strikes at what you've talked about this, Caitlin Beatty talks about platform being or celebrity being social power without proximity, right? So when you erase that proximity, it's dangerous. And I understand there's probably a large church pastor listening to this and go, listen, I can't be best friends with 1,000 people. I understand that, but you got to be best friends with someone. You got to be close to someone, or else that's hard on your soul. The other thing I'd say too, that I've observed just talking to pastors, a lot of people have this idea that a lot of pastors are egomaniacs and they just want to be the person in the limelight all the time. There's a flip side of this, where I've seen congregations that put a lot of pressure on their pastor to be the one who's in the pulpit every single week, who's performing, who's doing, because there is this need to idolize people, to prop someone up. And so it's not always just coming internally, within leaders. It's sometimes external pressure as well. Because, I talked to a pastor recently, and he said, I'm really trying to share the pulpit. I'm trying to draw back and, preach maybe 45 times a year instead of 52. But whenever I do that, I just get all these angry people in my
Yeah.
congregation coming
Yeah.
up to me because they expect to hear him every Sunday. So it's tough. It's
Yeah.
definitely not simple.
What are some of the things that the congregation members and that church members in particular, Christians in general, about famous pastors and famous church leaders, what are some things that we should do to protect ourselves so that we're not lured into this following of celebrity thing?
Yeah, great question. I think the first thing is just to remind yourself that this spiritual leader is a human, fallible,
Mm.
frail, not above some of these temptations. And also, sometimes I'll be in a church where the pastor is kind of a mini celebrity. And often, even when a theological question comes up, people will turn to each other and say, "What did Pastor Bob say about that?" Like automatically. There's this sort of default where you just kind of, you quote the pastor, you go to whatever they believe about topic X. Hey, listen, that's great. I mean, hopefully that's, the pastor's feeding people and giving them sound teaching from the word. But open your Bible for yourself. Hopefully you're not just relying upon what the pastor's saying. Get, into the word and just don't take whatever they say as the gospel truth. Because sometimes that can be dangerous too, when it's like, I remember Francis Chan saying something to the effect of when he left his church, one thing that was kind of creeping him out was that he said he was hearing his name more than Jesus's. Right?
Yeah.
That's a problem. That's a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
So don't be one of those people that's just like, okay, whatever this pastor says, listen, honor your pastor, absolutely love them, respect them, but don't put them up there with Jesus. So that's one. And then, cut them some slack too, because I think part of it, like we expect pastors to be superheroes. So they are preaching 52 weeks a year. They
Mm-hmm.
are everywhere. And they can't do that, man. They need breaks. They need vacations. They need to share the pulpit, not just for the good of the congregation, but for their own health as well, and their own, just getting a break. So yeah, and it kind of goes back to that sharing the burden of ministry with the rest of the congregation. And so it's not just this guy or gal up on the platform doing it all for us, to us. We're doing it together and really having that
Yeah.
mentality.
Next up is Peyton Jones. He's an author and a church planter, and he made a bold statement in his book Church Plantology about the church growth paradigm. So I quoted Peyton in De-sizing the Church, specifically in Chapter 10, Beyond the Big Small Divide. According to him, the modern Western church has, quote, inherited a system that is built on something that no longer works, the church growth movement. He states that churches operating under the church growth paradigm are reported by denominational leaders to be in over 90% in decline, close quote. Here's some more from Peyton about that.
What if people got a taste of something different? They got a taste of community and they said, I'm just wrecked now. And I would say, really in the church growth movement, I tend to look at things as, Christ had 5 activities that expanded the kingdom, right? He prioritized people on mission. We would call that apostolic. That's mission. He created an experience of the presence and power of God. We would call that prophetic. He romanced people with the gospel. With grace. We would call that, evangelism. He cared for people's souls and made disciples. He poured into them, invested. So we'd say, oh, that's what a shepherd does. And then lastly, we have, he brought the wisdom of God through the word of God. So where you see those 5 things, those things are kicked down to the church. What I think happened in the 80s during the church growth movement was the church became a Johnny One Note. It was like, okay, this is the time of the evangelist. Because the evangelist, like Apollos rolls into Corinth after Paul gets there, Paul's apostolic. He creates kingdom culture and expands the borders of the kingdom. He crosses the frontiers. He creates a settlement. He's sowing the seeds of the gospel, watering through discipleship, and boom, he reaps a gathering. And Paul's churches, many of them, as you know, because I'm always recommending Grasshopper Myth, that literally Paul's churches, most of them were not big. And so when you look at that, you go, huh. So what he was trying to do was something a little different. And apostolic people or missionaries think different, right? They're all about penetration, penetrating this culture, establishing a kingdom outpost, and then multiplying that outward. We're not obsessed with size. But when Apollos rolls into Corinth, he begins to preach the gospel. It just blows up. And it says that tons of people are added to the church. That's all well and good, but those guys moved around. What happened during the 80s is we had these mobile evangelistic role that existed in places like Billy Graham. You go to a city, hey, what if I stayed here and I just built this big thing? And somehow that became the model. And Jesus did not model that. Paul did not model that. Because what we do in the church is we're often so reactionary, right? So after the church growth movement, then everybody went to missional communities, and that was going to be the new white hotness. Now, the missional community is what shepherds like. So then all of a sudden it becomes a shepherd's movement. And we say, oh, that's the way. That's the biblical way. That's what you want. What if, going out on a limb here, because I was a missionary overseas 12 years. I definitely left there as a well-behaved, reformed evangelical, got over there, started finding the Holy Spirit's real. He still does things that you read about in the book of Acts. But I started to, wow, how do I experience more of the presence and power of God? But without going to the extreme. See, each one of these movements will eventually, if left unattended, go to the extremes. I feel like what the church is starting to come into, perhaps, is the understanding that all of these different dynamics are a piece of what Jesus did and kicked down to the church. And if we would stop separating them out, we would stop being in an extreme. These are activities. They should not be models. They should be things that every church, regardless of its model, practices and engages in. You will see an increase of people coming to faith if you evangelize. You will see people going deeper in their faith if you disciple. You will see people, widening their faith if they experience more of the power and presence of God through the Holy Spirit. You will, and so I could just go on, but what I'm advocating is we build the mighty robot lion Voltron, right? Like all 5 of these lions, these activities of Christ need to come together in every church. And if we could do that, we'd be in balance, Karl.
Yeah.
We'd have a balance that looks like Jesus, because the evangelist by himself looks like Jesus's leg. The shepherding movement, that's like a piece of Jesus, but that's not Jesus.
Right.
It's just a piece.
Yeah. Also in Peyton's book, he quotes Ralph Moore, who said that if you build churches, sometimes you'll make disciples, but if you make disciples, you will always build the church. Here's a little more from Peyton on that important principle.
I think of those young families, people are spiritually hungry, but institutionally skeptical. And so what's happening is they're looking at your church down the street. And I think the future is for community churches. That's still my favorite form. Lean and mean, small, like something kind of under 100, where it's like Cheers, you want to go where everybody knows your name. You go into the door, people, your kids are growing up the same time, that you can still do an Easter egg hunt, that kind of stuff. You're not doing it to advertise out there all creepy in the community, like, hey, we're going to have pony rides and Easter egg. No, it's you love the people that come and join, and you want those kids to just be pumped and thrilled. And it's about the people. And I think this next generation coming up that are institutionally skeptical, when they see a large church, they think, well, there's a money suck. But when they see something, that's community-based, they think, there's a place I could raise my family. There's a place I could get help when I need it. There's a place I could make friends. I long for a day, Karl, where the church becomes the place where people know they can connect. And it was once upon a time. It stopped being that. And because of that, the world just created all these other areas, AA, which actually was started by Christians, but AA, other places, you almost have to go outside nowadays. And so what I appreciate about your ministry is you've allowed pastors to keep their soul, right? To not sell out and go big. If we're talking about punk bands back in the old days, they used to talk about selling out, going big, signing that label and losing your punkness. To turn your back on the crowds and focus on the individuals is what Jesus did. This is what we've been dedicating a lot of our ministry to, is teaching people how to regain what was lost from Jesus and the apostles. What did they know that we didn't? In every church, regardless of their size, their model, they can engage in those practices. That's the good news.
And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are 2 things you can do to help us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Secondly, consider becoming a financial partner on an ongoing or one-time basis. Just go to karlvaters.com/support, where you can give through Zelle, Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon using your bank account, credit, or debit card. This will help us as we continue to put these resources into the hands of the people who need them the most. Now let's hear from Greg Atkinson. Greg is a church consultant and the founder of the Kindness Group and Entree Church. Like Peyton, he was also drawn to the content of Chapter 10, Beyond the Big Small Divide. But Greg's interest was in a set of diagrams I created showing how important it is not to lump big and healthy churches on one end and small and unhealthy churches on the other end. Instead, I show how we can widen our understanding into a 2-dimensional approach, where in addition to small and unhealthy churches and big and healthy churches, there are also big unhealthy churches and small healthy churches. As someone who has consulted with a lot of big churches over the years, I asked Greg about his take on a church that he consulted at that was running 22,000 attenders, but according to him, it was operating in some ways like a church of 22 attenders. So I asked him, how does a church that's functioning in those ways become so big?
1, very charismatic leader, very well-known leader. 2, the only show in town. It's just kind of the church to go to with a charismatic leader who is well-known. And so they just kind of, I remember I was on staff. Well, I've been on staff at 3 mega churches, but the last church I was on staff at blew up from a church plant to 3,300 people. And as a staff, as leadership, we would call it Baby Huey. That's what we called it. Like, we were a big baby, that we did not have things in place for a church of 3,300. We grew too quickly, too fast. And in a matter of 3 to 5 years, we're running 3,300. And we as leaders would call it Baby Huey because we had just exploded. And again, charismatic leader, very similar leader, very charismatic leader, good teacher. And the church it outgrew its systems. And so there were things that should have been in place that were not. And you ever heard that expression where you're like building the plane while you fly it kind of thing? It was a mess. And so with that church of 22,000, what I noticed and what I disagreed with the lead pastor about, and where we had kind of some intense moments discussing it behind the scenes, was they didn't have a value of excellence. And in some of my talks where I go around and I teach on the why of hospitality, and I also said this on another podcast, I said excellence transcends. It doesn't matter what style you are, what denomination, what size, you can still be excellent. You can be like I was a part of an inner city church plant of 40 people, you could still be excellent. You could be a church plant of 80 people that I was a part of here in my hometown, and you can still be excellent.
If you become big, but you're unteachable,
Right.
You're unhealthy. If you stay small, but you're teachable, you're healthy. Or at least that is an aspect of health anyway.
Teachable and humble, to be able to say, hey, we don't know it all. We can improve. Help us improve. Not that I know it all, but I come in with new eyes. So it doesn't matter how long you have been in existence. I walk in and it's brand new to me. I'm a professional at getting lost. If I get lost at your church, I'll point it out and say, I was confused. I have been in churches so large where I did not know where the auditorium was. I didn't know where to go into the service, couldn't find it, and had to ask for directions. Please point me to the auditorium. And so I am used to getting lost. And I am so familiar with churches from going to so many churches that if I get confused, I know everybody else is.
Yeah, you know all the underlying invisible cultural things about church. So if somebody who knows, it's like the chairman of Walmart getting lost in one of their stores.
Right. Right.
There's a certain pattern to these things.
There's a certain pattern.
And if
I'm getting lost, something's wrong.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So teachability, humility, 2 huge parts of what makes a quality and excellent church. And size has far less to do with it than we've been taught over the years. So let's stay open, let's stay humble, let's stay teachable. My second to last guest in this episode is Stan Givens. Stan is the pastor of Northside Bible Church in Mobile, Alabama. This congregation is one of the best examples I know of a small church that is having a massive impact in their community, including bringing the other churches and pastors together for encouragement and ministry. So, not surprisingly, what caught Stan's attention in Desizing the Church was the emphasis on discipleship. Here's Stan's take on this essential topic.
You have that section where you just talk about discipleship is it, and discipleship fixes everything, and I call it Jesus simple. I'm the C student in the room, so I call it Jesus simple. That's all he did, is walk people alongside him, follow me, and I'm going to show you how to do this. And what is he doing? He's loving, great commandment, great commission. He's loving communities to let them find who he is as the Son of God. And that's all he asks us to do. The one command he gives the disciples when he leaves, one command is go and make disciples. If you're a disciple, you're going, we're already disciples. What do you mean make them? Well, we were made into disciples, so now we just follow him. We really overcomplicate it. We really do.
Well, that was one of the questions that came up with some of the pastors was, what does discipleship look like?
Right.
And one of the things that you and I both talked about with them was take somebody along for the ride. Walk us. What's
Don't go get the church groceries by yourself. If the church needs to restock on something and you're the guy, you're the pastor in charge of that at a small church a lot of times, grab one of the guys. Could be a youth, could be an older man, could be a young family guy. Just grab him and say, you're going to help me. So now we're stuck in the truck together for a little while, right? When you see good works, when the culture sees good works happening for no value other than the fact that it's good to do, they go, something's different with that family. Something's different with that guy. And that changes everything. So we can disciple unsaved people. We, as you know, our church connects with a whole lot of people from a whole lot of brokenness. And a lot of times they're far, far from God, and we just make them hang out with us while we're serving food to people or going to feed the homeless. They just come along with us and help us hand this out of the van. And then they're like, that was really fun. And you go, yeah, it's great, isn't it? When you're not about yourself, you're about others. What did Jesus say? Love one another. Don't be about yourself anymore. So Jesus simple is walk alongside others, care for them, show them my love, and then share the gospel, share the message.
Beautiful. I couldn't have put it better myself. And now, batting cleanup, we have Sean Nemecek. He's the author of The Weary Leader's Guide to Burnout. One of the main points I make in Desizing the Church is that our obsession with bigness is a huge source of frustration and burnout for so many pastors, even for those who win at the numbers game. In response, Sean and I talk about how this affects different types of pastors. So one of the things that I bring up right away at the very beginning of the book is that I believe that this obsession with bigness is probably the biggest but least considered factor in all kinds of church dysfunctions, including pastoral burnout. What's your take on that, and what's been your experience in that area?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I have 3 different areas of pastors that I often see in burnout. They're kind of the 3 most common. One of them are small pastors who think their church should be bigger, and they're depressed that they don't have more people showing up. The second one is church planters whose churches didn't grow and didn't take off. And the third is large church pastors who are kind of second-tier leadership, the ones who have to keep the machine going, and they're kind of constantly pulling on that crank and having to keep the momentum going. And the obsession with bigness affects all 3 of those and really contributes to major burnout because they have really unreasonable expectations from what they've been told, church should look like. So I do see some senior pastors in large churches, executive pastors in large churches, but most of the time it's the next tier down. It's the worship leaders, it's the discipleship pastors, it's the ones who are involved in getting small groups going, and just that constant momentum that has to be maintained is really just killing them. And I even had one of them say to me, they felt like the megachurch was going to die because there wouldn't be enough of that second tier leader left to do the work.
In Desizing the Church, I write about the impact of the Great Awakenings in American history, both their positives and some unintended negative consequences. This has been a big area of interest for Sean in the work he's done with burned out pastors, so here's his take on that.
So this is an area I've been really interested in for a long time. Just the idea of how revivals have both a positive and a negative side to them. And I thought your book was just really insightful in just naming the different movements. For example, in the training that I've had, nobody ever mentioned a third Great Awakening. And you talked about how the holiness movement, the Pentecostal movement, came out of, is influenced by Billy Sunday and Charles Spurgeon and things like that. And that was really a helpful connection for me. Even seeing that, how that translated into the more modern movements like Billy Graham and some of the larger evangelists that we've seen in the last 50 years. It's really fascinating to me to see how even those movements were obsessed with numbers, and how that obsession sometimes led to kind of inflating the reports, and making people think that, it was the number of people that came forward that was most important, rather than the number of people who remained committed to Christ long term. And so, so just reading the history of this was fascinating, seeing how you documented the idea of what the church growth movement was supposed to be about, and how that morphed over time into something completely different than was originally intended. That was really helpful.
Oh, I'm grateful for that. Thank you. As we bring this in for a landing on this short podcast, from your expertise as the guy who knows about burnout, knows how to spot it, and knows how to help us overcome it, what would you say to any of the pastors who are feeling this obsession with bigness, and there maybe because of our conversation or because of reading Desizing the Church, they're beginning to recognize that this drive for numbers has a downside to it that maybe they didn't see before? Do you have one or two pieces of advice to conclude with to those folks who are just beginning to consider that this might be a thing that they need to address?
Yeah, one of the major conversations I have to have with almost every pastor who's in burnout is that we need to start looking at the outcomes as something that's beyond our control, and recognize that those belong to God. Release the expectations that we place on ourselves to grow the church to a certain size, and instead just focus on faithful day-to-day ministry and leave the outcomes to what the Holy Spirit wants to do, rather than what we can generate. Because the last thing we want to do is generate a big crowd that has nothing to do with what God was doing. That's one of the major conversations we have to have. Another is, I am a big fan of large churches. I attend a fairly large church, and there are some large churches that are doing things really well. And it's when they focus on the formation of disciples, rather than the event of the Sunday service or the big events throughout the year, that those churches really thrive and grow. And I see the staff in those churches usually doing really well.
Yeah, I just earlier today, before you and I chatted, had a conversation with a good friend whose church has been growing exponentially recently, and he's almost mourning the idea, we're not a small church anymore, but this is where the Lord is taking us, and so we're going to honor where the Lord is taking us. And I'm cheering him on. Absolutely. This is something that is happening organically, that the Lord is doing. And as he's doing that, he is continuing to reach out to the smaller churches around, continuing to encourage them, and really working hard to lift up the church in his region, and not just the people sitting in front of him on a Sunday morning. And I think this, to me, is one of the main messages of Desizing the Church. It's that we actually want to have a greater impact for the kingdom of God in general than simply the people who are sitting in front of me on a Sunday morning. And this obsession with bigness is not a big church thing. It's not a small church thing. It's a cultural, societal thing that is poisoning the well in ways that we don't recognize.
I was talking with a pastor yesterday who had been on staff at North Point, and now he's planted a church, and he's depressed that his church is only 250 people.
Wow. Yep.
And so I said, you need to read this book, Desizing the Church. And I told him what it was about. And he says, I think you're right that I need to read it, because as soon as you said the title, I felt angry.
Oh. Oh, I love that last bit from Sean. Maybe that pastor sounds like you or someone you know. Maybe the title Desizing the Church has set off alarm bells, or perhaps some of the content we've talked about has challenged you. Well, maybe that's a sign that there's something in it for you too. While I'm not looking to offend anyone, it doesn't surprise me that the subject matter of desizing the church is a hot topic for many. But that may be the main reason we need it right now, after all. Thanks so much for listening to this mini podcast series on desizing the church. After this, we're going back to our regular bi-weekly schedule with some great guests coming up. Next up, 2 weeks from now, will be Dan Nichols. He's a pastor in Cortland, New York, and he's the founder of the Northeast Collaborative. He and I will be talking about the importance of churches collaborating with each other, plus we'll get into the importance of killing consumerism in order to do good ministry in a post-Christian context. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaters. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Karl Vaters, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.